The escort convoy of gleaming MP jeeps roared through Cowan at maximum speed, sirens blaring, flags flying, and machine guns trained menacingly on both sides of the road. God help anyone or anything in this Delta village that got in the way, be they ox carts, bicycles, chickens, or footmobile peasants carrying heavy loads. All were splashed with mud flying up from the rain-soaked road or sent scurrying out of the way. Some were even flattened. It could have been a scene from a movie or a mechanized version of the great Mandarin Prince returning to his palace. What it was, in fact, was Colonel Hahn, my counterpart and commander of the 44th Special Tactical Zone, making a routine journey back to his plush Chowlan villa from the Zone HQ helipad, alienating all the people whose hearts and minds he had to win if we were to succeed. The first time I saw this procession, I would have laughed if it hadn't been so sickening. Han was extremely fat by any standard, much less a Vietnamese one, with Barney Google eyes, an arrogant manner, and no concern at all about the people he hurt or the hatred that burned in their eyes. As his new advisor, I told him the warlord crap had to stop. He couldn't have been less concerned about what I had to say, and as he waddled away, I knew it was just the beginning of a long struggle between us, one that would end only when one of us got fired. At the time I arrived in the zone, the Viet command I was tasked to advise was like a one-year no-wind clock at the end of its last tick. There was little sense of urgency when President Tu came to visit the day after I got there, and I saw rocks being lined up and dilapidated equipment that hadn't been maintained since it left the depot, suddenly becoming the very focus of attention as the Viets dashed around their compound in frantic preparation for Tu's arrival. I marvelled at what might have been achieved if only we could have captured all that energy and converted it from facade building to fighting the enemy. Team 50, the US advisory command I took over, was also in pretty poor condition, largely due to 3 months of non-stop Cambodian operations that had stretched people and assets beyond the breaking point. But that was not all. The men of Team 50 were also suffering from long-term isolation. San Village, home of the 44th STZ headquarters, was located in the boonies, smack dab in the middle of the Delta, which itself was in the middle of nowhere. The team compound, a rectangular fort adjoining another rectangular fort that belonged to Colonel Han and our counterpart Vietnamese command, was in a terribly run-down state, its security tenuous at best, and it had virtually no recreation facilities. There was simply nothing to do there. My first thought was that jail couldn't have been much worse than the conditions the men of Team 50 were enduring. While I understood the widespread lethargy and apathy among the team, what amazed me was that the guys hadn't gone truly crazy. They were stuck in an endless circle of unsatisfying work and unshakable tedium. As was my SOP, I immediately began bringing in my own team to breathe a little life into the outfit. Milt Menjivar and Tom Hancock joined from the Airborne Division, and Guerrilla Commander Ed Clark came from the 39th. First, Sergeant Joseph D. and Lieutenant Colonel Bert Walrath signed on from the 101st, the former as Team 50's new Sergeant Major, and the latter, most recently, G4 of the 25th Division, as my deputy. When his outfit went home, Walrath brought with him a windfall of Lightning Division supplies and equipment, including a complete military affiliate radio station, Mars, which went a long way towards sprucing up my new command. Jack Frenchy Fry, my wayward private from D Company, 18th Infantry, now a master sergeant with 3 years of hard combat duty in Vietnam under his belt, was another welcome addition to the team. Many others were in the pipeline, including level-headed warrior Ben Willis, who joined as soon as he was released from the Vietnamese Airborne Division. Concurrent with the advisory side of things, my first order of business in the zone was to build esprit in my tired command. Fortunately, in doing so, I was able to attend to my second order of business as well, which was to get our living situation squared away. Operational conditions permitting, every afternoon around 1600, the whole listless group met at the volleyball court. We then divided up details so that, as SC materials became available, we would ultimately rebuild the compound. No one wore jackets during these sessions, so there was no rank. Majors, captains, lieutenants, sergeants, PFCs, and 2 light colonels all worked, sweated, and got in shape together. We also forged a team. The overall purpose of the 44th STZ was to interdict enemy infiltration of both personnel and supplies from Cambodia through the Delta. The mission of Team 50 was to advise and assist the Vietnamese zone commander, a division-level command, and his subordinate units. At this time in the war, July 1970, the zone did not have many fixed regular units to accomplish the task other than 3 Viet Ranger battalions and Company D, 5th Special Forces Group and its counterpart organisation, which commanded a number of predominantly Cambodian airborne-trained Mike Force battalions. The zone's units consisted solely of all the regional forces and popular forces in the area. Any other regular ARVN units we might need, airborne Marines, armoured cav, or straight-leg infantry, were attached to us on a mission basis from all over Vietnam. Our AO was about the size of Luxembourg. It was a huge battlefield, stretching through the Mekong Delta from Giang Province in the west, along the Cambodian border to the 3rd Corps boundary in the east. It encompassed 3 provinces and parts of 2 more, and satisfied the major infiltration routes that led to war zones C and D near Saigon. I was very familiar with the eastern part of the area, at least from my 9th Division experience. The Hardcorps had conducted many operations in the Kien, Tuong and Dong provinces. It had been a year since my last view of the Delta, and had I been a casual observer or a 1-year tourist, things would have looked just great. VC activity seemed to be at a minimum. There were almost no big fights, roads were not being cut, VC tax collection didn't appear significant, and there were few terrorist tricks. All in all, it was a quiet battlefield. Unquestionably, the recent attacks into Cambodia had knocked the enemy off balance and torn deeply into the VC supply setup. The tourists were once again crowing, "We've got them on the ropes," as they took the enemy's lack of aggressiveness as a sure sign of defeat. Anyone who'd been in Vietnam for any decent length of time, however, or had any understanding of the nature of the war, knew that was too simple an analysis. The VC were not on the ropes. They had just shifted down to a lower gear, as they had after they were hit so hard in Tet of 68. They'd gone back to Phase 1 insurgent warfare, educating, getting to the people, rebuilding their infrastructure, solving the complex logistics problems that the joint US-ARVN forays into Cambodia and the closure of the port at San Vin had dealt them. In short, they were doing all the things necessary to maintain their ability to wage a protracted war. Always a step behind, the US strategists were measuring the VC's Phase 1 activity in the Delta on a Phase 3 World War II scale, and delighting themselves with the result. But even worse for the war effort during this critical period of Vietnamization was these strategists accepting without examination an untenable corollary to their incorrect assessment, that if the VC were down and out, then ARVN must be up and running. Nothing could have been further from the truth, and the zone was a perfect example of why. Under Colonel Han, the South Vietnamese forces in the zone had reached a complete accommodation with the enemy, while the US Black Hawk Air Cav Squadron, who worked with us in the 9th Division, and his lazy habits, Han embodied everything wrong with the South Vietnamese command structure. His refusal to take responsibility and his preference for a cushy life over actual military engagement had a detrimental effect on the operations in the zone. So I pressed on. I realized that to get Han to pull his weight, I had to leverage every resource at my disposal, including his greed and vanity. Once I got him to see the value in helicopter operations, thanks to Woodmansey's briefings, I hoped it would improve the overall effectiveness of the Vietnamese units. But Han's insistence on a 9-to-5 approach to warfare and his resistance to conducting operations on weekends continued to be a stumbling block. To address this, I was adamant about running operations 7 days a week. The VC in the zone were notably lax on weekends, and I wanted to exploit their vulnerability. Colonel Han's protests about the need for rest for his soldiers were dismissed. Many of my men were on their 3rd or 4th tours, and most of his commanders had been avoiding battle for years. I emphasized that a key principle of war is surprise, and the VC would never expect operations on weekends. If we launched operations during those times, we could achieve surprise and potentially gain a tactical advantage. Despite Han's continued resistance, I persisted. During the next morning's briefing, Han had arranged a helicopter for his wife to travel to Saigon for shopping. When I learned of this, I made it clear that the helicopter would not be available. The aircav was not to be used for personal errands, and we needed every asset for operational purposes. Han was displeased, but I used the situation to reinforce the importance of our operational needs. I suggested that Han's wife take a jeep instead. The journey would be lengthy but not particularly dangerous, and it would give her a chance to see the country and its people. Han was not pleased with this suggestion and tried to negotiate, but I stood firm. I proposed that we could resolve his problem if he agreed to launch operations on the days we had discussed. Han, begrudgingly, accepted my terms, and I arranged for a helicopter to be available for his wife's trip. Over time, Han and I reached an understanding, though we never liked each other. I took satisfaction in knowing that his superiors, including General Truong, recognized the value of my work despite Han's complaints about my demeanor. General Mao, who supported my efforts wholeheartedly, was well aware of Han's shortcomings and urged me to keep pressing for improvements. Han's removal was complicated by his connections to President Tu and his inner circle. Even though his incompetence was apparent, his political connections made him difficult to remove. General Truong's support was helpful, but it wasn't enough to counter the political influence protecting Han. Despite this, my work continued to expose his failures and push for better performance from the Vietnamese command. Han remained a symbol of the inefficiency and corruption that plagued the South Vietnamese command. My mission was to make a difference despite the obstacles and work towards achieving our goals in the zone. The struggle with Han was a significant part of that mission, and every day was a battle to ensure that our efforts were not in vain. And now we were up against the zone, going out day after day, finding the enemy and stirring up fights with scout and gunships whenever they got something decent going. When we relayed the word back to Han CP, we'd be told that no troops were available for commitment that day, or that it was too late, even when their call came early in the morning. When Black Hawk Company Lieutenant Colonel John Jack Woodmansey alerted me to this routine, I immediately made plans for it to stop. No way was the Air Cav going to fight the war for Colonel Han. So the next time Zone G3 advisor Tom Hancock got word from the Black Hawks that the units were unavailable to pile on a contact the Air Cav had stirred up, I played my card. I called Woodmansey and told him to give his men the next day off. I didn't want any choppers sent to the zone. The next day came, bringing with it a very perplexed, soon-to-be ex-Colonel Han. "Where is my Air Cav?" he asked. "It's not your Air Cav," I said. "It's mine, and you're not getting it anymore." "Why not?" Colonel Han demanded. "Because every day you and your troops sit on your asses and let the Air Cav fight the war for you. You're not pulling your weight, and if you don't pull your weight, you don't get anything from me. Not today, tomorrow, not ever." Han couldn't believe his ears. He stormed through the door between our offices and our little command building on the Vietnamese side of the compound, threatening to call my superiors all the way up to the president and assuring me I'd soon be out of a job. 2 more days passed. Han complained to anyone who would listen but remained immovable. I did have to explain what I was doing to my boss, Major General Hal Mao, the CG of Delta Military Advisory Command, who supported me 100%. Meanwhile, I took the time to try to figure out why, besides the accommodation factor, the units so obstinately refused to make helicopter insertions in the first place. Woodmansey had done a study and discovered they made pitifully few in relation to the number of times they used Air Cav assets. It soon occurred to me that perhaps part of the problem was that, after all this time, they still didn't really know how. On the 4th day, I wandered into Colonel Han's office. My counterpart was sulking. "You know, Colonel Han," I said, ignoring the fact that he didn't acknowledge my presence, "you could be a hero." Han was immediately all ears. "A hero," he repeated, his Barney Google eyes popping, already envisioning himself in an even bigger convoy of jeeps with more flags and louder sirens. Yep, you could be the air cav expert in Vietnam. Our tiff was suddenly forgotten as Han eagerly embraced the idea. "But how do I do this?" he sputtered excitedly in his French-accented English. "Colonel Woodmansey will brief you on the plan, and I think it is very important for all your commanders to learn all they can about employing helicopters on the battlefield too." Jack Woodmansey, meanwhile, didn't have any particular plan to brief Han on, but he used the opportunity to introduce the Viet colonel to all the things he'd been unable to get through anyone's head in the past. The net result was a fine program in which the 71st Ground Troop gave the zone's units a week's training each, after which the Cavs choppers came in and gave the units a chance to practice inserts and extractions, and to get acquainted with the birds, with a US sergeant advising. I soon realized that the only leverage I had over my counterpart were my assets and his greed. As soon as we got the first drama of the choppers out of the way, another began when I told Han I wanted operations 7 days a week because the war under Han was a 9-to-5, 5 days a week business-as-usual affair. The VC in the zone were extremely loose security-wise on the weekends, so I wanted to take advantage of their vulnerability at this time. But Colonel Han protested, "My soldiers have been fighting for 24 years. They need to rest on weekends. It is different for you advisors. You only stay for 1 year." After reminding him that many of my guys were on their 3rd and 4th tours, and that most of his commanders had been avoiding battle for 24 years, thereby rendering his entire argument null and void, I said, "A key principle of war is surprise. The VC would never expect us to launch an operation on a Saturday or a Sunday, so if we did, we would achieve surprise. Now my job is to get you off your arse and start you fighting this war yourself in the most effective way possible. If you don't want to do it, okay. If you don't want to take my advice, fine. But if you don't, I promise you're not going to get a thing from me, Colonel Han, not even the time of day." As was par for the course, Han immediately tested me on this. At the next morning's briefing, while I was being briefed by Captain B.J. Jensen, our Black Hawk LNO, on the allocation of all the assets, 3 choppers to move ammunition to a firebase here, 20 choppers to operate with the Rangers there, etc., I was told Colonel Han had a chopper going from Cowan to Saigon. "What's that one for?" I asked. "His wife, sir," was the reply. "Scratch it," I said. After the briefing, I went back to my office on the Viet side of the compound. Within minutes, the phone rang. It was Colonel Han next door. "And how are you, Colonel Han?" I asked. "Oh, not very happy today," Colonel Han replied. "I'm sorry to hear that. It makes me sad that you aren't happy," I said. "Why aren't you happy?" "Well, there has somehow been a bad mistake made." "A mistake? Where?" "Within your headquarters, Colonel. The helicopter I ordered for my wife is not available, and she is ready to go to Saigon today with her friends to shop." "There's not going to be any helicopter for your wife, Colonel Han. I cannot afford that kind of blade time. It's a wasted asset." "Oh, that makes me very sad," Han sighed. "Yes, I am sad too," I said. "Why don't you tell her to take a jeep? I'd be happy to give her one of our jeeps. It's only 150 clicks through safe country, according to ARVN and Navy reports, and she'll enjoy the ride. She could visit the people and tell you what's happening with them, the ones we're fighting for." "Oh, Colonel, she would not like that at all. May I come to see you?" "No, I'll come to see you." I put down the phone and walked through the door into Han's office. I sat down. "This is a very difficult problem," I began, "but I do believe we could work it out if you agreed to kick off that operation we discussed for Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday." "Oh, you are a very difficult man, Colonel." "I know that, Colonel Han, but we are involved in a great war. We must all make sacrifices." "Yes, Colonel, you are right. I will call my Chief of Staff at once and tell him to alert the units you request." "Thank you," I said, "and I will find a chopper for your wife to go to Saigon." Over time, Han and I understood each other. For a long time he hated my guts, and I never stopped hating his. I took great satisfaction on those occasions when word came down that his boss, the 4th Corps CG and a great general by any army standards, General Truong, thought I was doing a good job. Han called him all the time, complaining that I was arrogant, pushy and abrasive, all absolutely true, and recommending that I be relieved. Meanwhile, General Mao urged me to keep a running book on Han's numerous shenanigans, even as I kept up the pressure for him to perform. Mao was a good man, an old soldier from Abrams's tanker club, who knew Han was worthless, and the sooner we were rid of him, the better. Unfortunately, removing him was no small chore. For Han even to have the job he had, he was most likely a friend or business associate of President TW's, or one of his top cronies. Even the word of a soldier as well respected as Truong couldn't stand up against that kind of firepower. Yet there was no question that Han was a corrupt, lazy bum with his overstuffed physique and French accent, and Droopy, with his moustache, FDR cigarette holder dangling between his teeth, and aviator shades, was an unabashed warlord who got a percentage from every activity in the zone he controlled. He managed all GI laundry and bar activities in Cowan, and likely in other district and provincial towns as well. A Vietnamese could not open any business at all without Han's approval, a nod that invariably cost a fixed percentage of the profit. When I went with him on his rounds of all the provinces, Han didn't hide the fact that each province chief paid off anyone who might have objected to the extortion. Those who had objected had been relieved on some trumped-up charge of incompetence long before and replaced with one of Han's own men. Meanwhile, back at the war under Han, every major operation we had was compromised. The VC found out what we were doing faster than our subordinate units did. I felt sure they were getting copies of our operations orders, which could only mean there was at least one high-ranking VC in our camp. We tried many tricks to catch him, but never did. As a countermeasure, I pushed for minimum warning orders and fake op hordes whenever possible. Of course, Colonel Han fought me all the way on this and virtually everything else, but I just kept blackmailing and bribing him until he realized that by making an effort to fight the war, he could do even better for himself than he had to date. From Han's point of view, our problems as good as disappeared when, a few months into my tenure, the tiny, clapped-out trailer that had masqueraded as his PX, selling toothpaste and cigarettes, was replaced by a small building filled to overflowing with the best in booze, stereo equipment, tape recorders, and so on. From then on, when I really wanted something done that Han would not cooperate with, I'd just take him for a walk through the PX. "Come over to my compound," I'd say. "I want you to see the progress we're making." I'd show him around, and on our way to the mess for a cup of coffee, we'd swing by the PX. On these occasions, the place was generally closed, but I'd make sure my PX sergeant, the redoubtable Sergeant Bilko-like Master Sergeant Frank Schwatt, was on hand to open up for my counterpart. Schwatt, a good friend of John Westmoreland, had managed the $2 million a month Saigon PX before taking up my offer to come back to the zone to start ours from scratch. "Whatever you want, Colonel," I'd say to Han, watching my counterpart virtually froth at the mouth with excitement as he looked at the mountains of goodies stacked shelf upon shelf. "You want a case of scotch? Schwatt, get the Colonel a case of scotch. A dozen cartons of Salem cigarettes? Schwatt, a dozen cartons of Salems for the Colonel. Oh, and a radio too. Schwatt, why don't you just get a list? We'll get some coffee, and Colonel Han's aide will come over later to pay for the stuff and pick it up. Right, Colonel?" At this point, Colonel Han would only be able to nod his head vigorously, beside himself with the grand or two of unauthorized MPC he'd spend at the PX that morning. He could double it before sunset on the black market. "But just one thing, Colonel," I'd say as we walked toward the door, Han having left his precious list in Schwatt's care. "Before you pick this stuff up, remember that operation we were talking about earlier? The one you said was impossible at such short notice?" "Oh no, Colonel," Han would enthuse. "It is very possible. It is an excellent idea." Time after time we went through this routine. I blatantly bought Han's cooperation, and he sold it to me as shamelessly as the village con man. While it was true that letting him have free rein through the PX was a serious violation of mass regulations, not only did I not care, but I encouraged all my officers and senior NCOs to offer the same service to their counterparts. What the hell? The US was spending billions of dollars to Vietnamize and win this war, and yet just a few unauthorized PX goodies grabbed the Viet brass right where they lived. I had less luck with the Cambodian officers whom Premier and Defence Minister Lon Nol sent across the border for a crash course in battalion and brigade operations. We were directed to set up an instant infantry school for these men, now that the war had moved decisively into their backyard. But it quickly became clear that the Cambodians were much more interested in Vietnamese women and having a good time than in learning skills to defend their country. These officers were all soft, fat, rich playboys who, by comparison, made the South Vietnamese look like stormtroopers. They arrived in Cowan from Cambodia in a convoy of old Mercedes-Benzes. One guy threw around $100 bills like peanut shells, claiming he'd gotten them from the CIA. When one very corpulent full colonel was found drunk out of his brain, running and dancing around the parade field, right next to my quarters, stark naked in the middle of the night, I just shook my head. The whole affair gave new meaning to the term pissing in the wind. Even so, I could get a whole different picture of how things were going if I talked to the right people. Time and again, I'd find every reason to believe it. The starched briefers at Diaki and Cantho or MAKV in Saigon snapped their pointers onto precise graphs and charts, and invariably cited impressive statistics of Vietnamization's ever-widening success. The relevant information was always presented so logically and persuasively that I'd walk out of those briefings thinking I must be crazy. I'd seriously begin to question my own absolutely certain on-the-ground observations and those of my team, in deference to those seemingly airtight official reports. Fortunately, I'd only have to be back in the zone for a few hours to recognize I'd been seduced. What I'd heard was the same meaningless statistics, the same old artfully sanitized stuff. It just showed the incredible power those briefings and reports had. If, after all my years in Vietnam, I could still be taken in, even momentarily, should it have been a surprise how easily and eagerly fooled the tourists still were, and those with a desperate vested interest in Vietnamization. Many years later, a civilian advisor I knew told me of his experience in the mid-60s, providing Hamlet Evaluation System, HES, data to result-hungry superiors in his corps. While in fact the HES statistics were supposed to reflect the real progress of the pacification effort, according to this advisor, who had worked with the program for 4 years, both before and after US ground troops were deployed, HES was a night once a month when all the guys got together, had a party, got drunk, and tried to figure out what figures would make higher headquarters happy. In 1970 to 71, I could see that same sort of calculated deception going on, only now it was beginning at the highest headquarters, the Oval Office. Like Johnson before him, Nixon said he was not going to be the first president to lose a war. Since he couldn't win it, he and Kissinger had created Vietnamization so they could honorably walk away, and in the meantime keep the rest of the American people at bay. This was a perfect situation for the war managers who had done Lyndon Johnson such a terrible disservice with the sanitized zero-defect reports that had kept him in the dark as he wrestled with how to prosecute the war and had ultimately cost him the presidency. It was as if the system had come full circle. These same reports, which had been in large part responsible for escalating the war, were now eagerly sought after by the Nixon administration as the ultimate smokescreen for their abandonment of the effort. When I first arrived at Team 50, my men were living in World War II, style army barracks. The buildings had seen only the most basic maintenance, and little effort had gone into trying to make them comfortable. It was the same sad story all over the compound. The mess was terrible, the food was terrible, and there weren't even any clubs. There had been both officer and enlisted clubs before. Like virtually everything else in the compound, the clubs had been allowed to fall apart and turn to dust. The only exception to the overall rundown condition of my command was the quarters I moved into. While the troops lived in rotting barns, the senior advisor had a fully air-conditioned little house with 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, a kitchenette, a living room complete with a bar, and a full-time maid. It was very plush, but every time I walked in the door, I felt guilty. After a month, I had to give it up and moved myself, lock, stock and barrel into my office on the Vietnamese side of the compound. It had 4 rooms, and after a few modifications and a good clean-up, was totally livable. I gave my senior advisor quarters on the US side to the carpenters, to be renovated into the new officers and senior NCO club. This move proved to be a very significant gesture, not only for my men, but for the Vietnamese. Due to habitually light Vietnamese fingers at night, the gate between the American and Vietnamese sides of the compound was locked. The Vietnamese alone secured their side by living there with them. By moving into their quarters, I, the American senior advisor, proved I trusted them not only not to steal me blind, but also with my very life. The only real deficiency in my new quarters was the wall-to-wall mouse problem. I bought a bunch of mouse traps, explained their use to the Vietnamese woman who cleaned up the place, and told her that as part of her SOP each evening, she was to set these traps and report the mouse body count to me in the morning. The first morning, the maid excitedly reported a body count of 4. The second morning, she reported a body count of 3. The next morning's figure was the same, and then there was a body count of 1, and then a body count of none. The next day, there was another body count of none, and for the next week, there was no body count. I couldn't understand this because at night I heard mice scurrying all over the place. Finally, one evening, I did a little investigation and discovered that the reason for no body count was that no mouse traps had been set. The next day, I asked the maid why she wasn't setting traps anymore. "No more mice," she said. "How do you know that?" I asked. "No body count," she replied. "We killed them all." It was Vietnamese logic at its most eloquent, and just the way the South Vietnamese were fighting the war. If you couldn't see it, it wasn't there, and if it wasn't there, there was no reason to try to find it. What could you say to that? During the renovation of the officer club, we also began building an EM club. Additionally, I lit a torch under the mess sergeant's ass to get him fired up and producing good, wholesome food with a lot of variety. These acts alone did wonders to boost morale. In the first 3 months, I also got a good number of other programs off the ground designed for the health, welfare and morale of the team. From a Fat Man program, complete with diet for those who tipped the scales in the wrong direction due to boredom or laziness, to an in-country R&R program that gave every man on the team a 3-day vacation in Saigon or Vung Tau every month. Though we already had 2 daily briefings for the operational team, I organised weekly update briefings for the support personnel, who generally stuck in the compound every day and otherwise had no idea where they fit into the picture. Every Saturday afternoon, we had an award ceremony and a traditional trust-like retreat, followed by hail and farewell, a routine I'd learned from General Timothy at 2nd Corps. It always turned into one hell of a fun party designed to introduce new members to the team and say goodbye to any guys who were leaving. Every afternoon the building program continued. The hardest part was finding the construction materials we needed. Going through channels was a guarantee that little would ever get done, so I had an ongoing all-points alert out for building supplies. My first break was a report that a US Navy-owned commercial cement mixer was sitting abandoned in the middle of bandit country, apparently all that was left of a convoy that had been ambushed. After I checked the machine out myself by chopper to make sure it was salvageable, we organised an airmobile assault into the area with Lieutenant Jack Howitt's security platoon and pulled the thing out. Only then did we find it needed a few parts that were next to impossible to come by in South Vietnam. My only recourse was to organise an extra R&R for one of the men, who took a kit full of money to Hong Kong to get them. Soon the cement mixer was churning out as much concrete as we could have asked for. We poured bucket after bucket into metal forms to make cinder blocks, which became the basic stuff of all our construction. The rest of the building supplies I also got thanks to the US Navy from a hitchhiking construction battalion, CB commander, whom I picked up one day at the helipad of one of my units I'd been visiting. This guy's basic job was to visit and oversee the CB teams building things all over the Delta. But as we got to talking, it turned out he had no way to get around on his own. His job entailed constant travel, yet hitchhiking by chopper, airplane, jeep, truck or sampan was his only means of transportation. That didn't seem very fair to me, particularly since some, like myself, had virtually unlimited transport available. By the time the ride back to Cowan was over, I'd promised the CB the use of one of the zone's choppers every day if, in return, every week a landing craft mechanized, LCM, would arrive at my dock at Cairn, crammed from stem to stern with pallets of building materials from this guy's own Delta depot. From there, in terms of our construction, the sky was the limit. We started with a new cinder block wall around the compound, which included bunkers and firing positions. Just beyond that, we laid a concrete strip studded with broken glass to stop enemy sappers in the event that one managed to get through the barbed wire we'd set up in front of the concrete strip, and even more difficult past the ducks that patrolled in between, keeping the grass down and quacking out warnings of intruders. When the security requirement was squared away, we built a library. Over the next 9 months came a gym too, and a steam bath and massage parlour, immediately dubbed the Steam and Cream, which was staffed with reliable, trustworthy and above all clean females from Saigon, whom the team's doc checked out on a regular basis. Here a guy could have a massage or whatever else he arranged with the girls to keep himself from climbing the walls. Though highly irregular, this amenity was the least I could do for the troops. I figured if the French had their bordel mobile de campagne, mobile field brothel, which, as Bernard Fall wrote in Street Without Joy, cut down on desertions and violations of innocent civilian women, there was no reason why we shouldn't. It was the regulations that were wrong, and proof of that was in the fact that until the steam bath opened, we were averaging several cases of VD a week on the team, whereas afterward, when the place was in full swing, we had almost none at all. This was particularly fortunate for Tom Hancock, whose dubious taste in women coupled with his obsession with being the world's greatest, or at least most serviced lover, had landed him with more cases of clap than Audie Murphy had medals. At Pleiku, he ended up with 1 case too many for a normal dose of penicillin, and Doc Holly, the hardcore miracle worker then running a small Saigon hospital, had to lay him down and administer the antibiotic intravenously over a couple of days. Hancock was no less a handful than he'd been 5 years before in the 327. On one occasion in the zone, he overstayed his extension leave in Germany by 2 weeks, sending me 2 cables while he was there, not to explain or apologize for his absence, but to ask me to deposit $1,000 in his checking account in Saigon. Another time, when he hadn't been seen for a few days and couldn't be found anywhere, I was just starting to believe he'd been kidnapped by the VC. One of our Vietnamese workers eventually found him passed out between the huge blocks of ice in the ice house. No doubt it was only the alcohol in his blood that prevented him from freezing to death. Besides contributing enormously to the morale of Team 50, the Steam and Cream served 2 other vital functions. First, the actual steam room was strictly for team personnel, no Vietnamese allowed under any circumstances. It was totally spy-proof. The plans for many operations were sweated out there in total secrecy, with participants keeping their cool throughout with a few cold bottles of beer. The second vital function of the steam bath was its contribution to the Team 50 Compound Improvement Fund, an unauthorized bank established early to cope with the ever-burgeoning expenses associated with our continued construction work, improved food, magazine subscriptions, and anything else we couldn't scrounge in our quest for better conditions. Specific guidelines covered how much and what kind of money could be collected from our various concessions. For example, 30% of the gross was collected from the unauthorized but very convenient barber and tailor shops we set up in the compound. While the Steam and Cream gave Team 50 the same 30%, in its case, gross income was only that derived from the entrance fees for a straightforward steam bath and massage. We could have made a fortune out of the Steam and Cream, but I wasn't into running a brothel. Instead, 70% of the steam bath's gross, plus the revenue from all the extras, went to Mr. Ko, the Korean guy who ran the place and paid the girls. The bulk of our unauthorized funds was generated by another Team 50 institution, the highly successful monthly Monte Carlo night. Monte Carlo began when we got a gambling kit from a Las Vegas hotel. The kit basically consisted of printed velvet sheets that converted ordinary tables to craps and blackjack venues, and green visors for the dealers. It was Las Vegas's contribution to the war effort, and the hotel gladly filled Team 50's subsequent order for more dice, chips, and hundreds of decks of playing cards. The straightest guys on the team were always appointed to run the games, and on the first Saturday evening after payday, the Team 50 mess hall became Monte Carlo of the Delta. Besides generating a lot of money, the occasion was a great one for fun and excitement, with friends and friends of friends coming from all over the Delta to participate. The officers and EM clubs were closed for the night, so that the club girls could act as waitresses and hostesses. With low and high-stake tables for each game, we made sure nobody got carried away by the booze or the broads and lost his life savings. The entire thing was closely monitored, and the proceeds, which over time came to thousands and thousands of dollars, were accounted for and held by my XO, Captain Thomas Okuni, otherwise known as Judge because of his pre-Vietnam legal training. Under his watchful eye, no money ever went astray. Our compound improvement fund was further enriched by the outdoor snack bar we built, which adjoined our outdoor movie theatre. The theatre showed a different movie virtually every night, and where a guy could buy a beautiful steak sandwich or a hamburger if he didn't want to eat in the mess. The snack bar was another real money spinner. Between it and Monte Carlo, and later augmented by the Steam and Cream and other concessions, we soon didn't have to pass the hat, a practice I'd hated since Trieste, for anything. Farewell presents for departing team members, cross-contributions, quarterly parties complete with presents for the Vietnamese who worked in our compound as carpenters and cooks, and many other programs designed to improve both our lot and the lot of the Vietnamese all came out of the Compound Improvement Fund. In the end, we actually had enough money to redo not just our own side of the compound, but the Vietnamese side as well. Over there, thanks to a long line of indifferent commanders, both soldiers and their dependents had been living together in crowded, appalling squalor. Straw huts with pigs running through them, no electricity, and the only water coming from a communal well. When we were finished, just weeks before my tour in the zone was over, there were 24 units for Vietnamese soldiers and their families, complete with electricity and running water, and a compound school for 30 to 60 kids with a teacher whose salary was paid by our unauthorized fund. Lieutenant Mark Crick, the real construction man of the team, estimated that the materials alone cost $50,000. This was the accomplishment I was most proud of. The house and the school will live in the hearts of all Vietnamese in the 44th Zone, as a constant reminder of Colonel Hackworth's and Team 50's genuine concern for the people long after Team 50 has parted, proclaimed General High. By then, the zone's CG. This project, I wrote to Jennifer Bates, a woman who was to have as profound an influence on my life as Raphael Benjamin and Ward did in their ways, proves if there's a will, there's a way. It would be fair to say I operated in the zone with minimal supervision. The deputy and my closest superior, Major General John Cushman, worked out of 4th Corps headquarters at Can Tho, 75 kilometers away. Since I'd never liked being too near the flagpole anyway, this suited me just fine. I gradually slipped into the habit of doing whatever I wanted or whatever I felt needed to be done. For example, I noticed that while the guys on the team who came from airborne or special forces were stacked in their tailored camouflage gear, the rest of the men looked like GP medium tents in their regulation baggy OD uniforms. They looked terrible, and I got the feeling they knew they looked terrible. So I decided everyone would wear camouflage gear. It didn't matter if a guy was airborne or SF. I knew that once he was suited up as if he were, he'd feel he was, and that was the object. I had to do a little wheeling and dealing with old friends in the Vietnamese Airborne Division to get the uniforms. The path was cleared by a small cache of SKS rifles we had stashed, but before too long everybody on the team was strutting around in a couple of fine-looking cut-down parachute uniforms of their own. It would have been a happily ever-after story if not for one of General Cushman's visits to the compound. He mentioned that a hell of a lot more of my men were wearing parachute uniforms than the team had airborne slots. I explained to him how the uniforms had been part of the deal I'd had to make with studs like Hancock and Menjivar to get them to come to the zone. As for the rest of the men, well, sir, it just kind of happened. Cushman said he understood, but that there were army regulations to consider. Bearing that in mind, he wanted those uniforms off all non-airborne personnel immediately. "I can't do that, sir," I said. "I told the men they could wear them. They've spent their money cutting them down, and they take a lot of pride in those uniforms. So if you insist on this, I'll have no recourse but to request relief." It was only a partial bluff. I didn't want to quit the zone, but I had to stand firm. If I gave in, I'd lose so much faith in my command it'd be even worse than quitting. Cushman immediately suggested a compromise. From that moment, as my old personnel rotated home, their replacements would go back to Army-issued olive drab. Within a certain number of weeks, everybody else, less airborne, would return to OD too. I agreed in principle, but after the general left, I came up with a much better arrangement. After the deadline, when everyone was supposed to phase back into their regulation jungle fatigues, the new rule was that you could wear your camouflage uniform wherever and whenever you wanted, except if you went to Can Tho. There, non-airborne guys had to wear their regulation baggy fatigues. If anyone wearing their parachute uniform accidentally ran into General Cushman outside of Can Tho, the rule was to play it cool, escape, and evade. We soon learned that in public, Cushman's tactic was to actively ignore the evidence of the breached regulation. However, if the general came to the compound, it had to appear as if we were playing by his rules. Fortunately for all concerned, it was standard operating procedure for all inbound helicopters to request permission to land on our pad, so we always had a warning of Cushman's impending arrival. When his helicopter was inbound, the compound's ground attack siren was activated. The camouflage-clad team knew that the alarm screaming in the middle of the day did not indicate a VC attack, but was their signal to drop whatever they were doing and change into their OD outfits. The guard at the front gate even had his regulation uniform hanging up in his guard box to slip into in time to salute Cushman as he drove up to the compound about 10 minutes after the first warning. General Cushman and I hit another snag in our relations when I decided to change the name of the compound. When it first arrived, it was called something like the Major Orville C. Snodgrass Compound. Logically, I asked who this unfortunate fellow was, and was told he had been a military intelligence major who, just as the zone was being established, stood in the middle of the compound in broad daylight when a Viet Long 82 mm mortar round slammed in and blew him to pieces. Since he was the first guy killed in the zone, the place was named after him. I said, "Well, that's just not going to do. We aren't going to have this compound named after some dead wimp. We're going to name it after a live hero." I promptly dubbed my new home the John P. Garrock Compound. This met with unanimous approval from the airborne Ranger Mafia, who all knew and admired Garrock as a great warrior. It was no less appropriate since Garrock had been the zone's first senior advisor. We made a beautiful sign in Ranger colours in Garrock's honour and hoisted it up on the arch at the front gate, where Major Snodgrass's memorial had previously resided. Cushman noticed it on his next visit the very minute he drove through the gate. "What is that sign?" he asked me. "John P. Garrock Compound, sir," I replied. "It's the new name of the compound." "Who authorized it?" "I did, General." "You didn't go through the Department of Heraldry?" "No, sir." "Hackworth, you can't do that. You know you can't do that, and I want that sign changed back right now." A few words about General Cushman. He was an energetic, even overzealous man, a very articulate, intelligent, academic philosopher type, and a West Point engineer. He was also an instant army aviator, the latest punch on the old ticket for senior officers, ever since Chief of Staff Westmoreland went through ridiculously abbreviated flight training and qualified. He lived up to the warning my predecessor, Special Forces Colonel Bob Hassinger, had given me about him. If his motor's not running, his mouth is. Cushman struck me as very much the same type of soldier as William Childs Westmoreland, hard-charging, ambitious, super straight, and without one streetwise bone in his body. He was a cheerleader for the war effort, And, since he didn't understand the vets or recognize their total exhaustion with the war or their endemic corruption, he was able to maintain his super-optimistic views. Cushman was as conventional in his thinking as 99% of the US generals in Vietnam. While he might have been a great commander in a conventional war somewhere, he didn't have a clue about the present guerrilla battlefield. Generally speaking, his ignorance worked in my favor. Except for his once-a-month visits, when he came around full of praise for my guys and everything we were doing, using Team 50 as an example to get his other 3 division-level advisory teams cracking, Cushman generally left us alone as my men turned the screws and got the VIs producing. Cushman was mad as hell about that sign, and he left me no room to maneuver. I wasn't going to quit over it, and this time he was the one standing in the door, so I took the sign down. Still, I thought it was a raw deal, and so did my boys. After discussing it, we decided we'd just have 2 signs: Garrick for general purposes and Snodgrass for general purposes. The only person inconvenienced by this was the guy on guard at the front gate. Now, when he heard the ground attack siren announcing Cushman's arrival, not only did he have to change his uniform, but he also had to set up and climb the long ladder we permanently stationed behind the guard position for this contingency, change the sign, climb down, put the ladder away, and be the very model of smiling military precision when the general drove through the front gate a few minutes later. We got away with that one, but there was always something else I'd come up with that Cushman would lock my heels together and counsel me about. Often he got so pissed off he'd just yell, like the time he got word that I told my guard at the front gate to shoot 2 US Navy guys who came to the compound to retrieve their cement mixer if they moved the machine so much as 1 inch outside the compound. I mean, we found it, we dragged it back, we repaired it, and paid for it out of our own pockets. As far as I was concerned, the only way the Navy was going to get that cement mixer back was if I hooked it under a chopper, dropped it from 5,000 feet over the exact spot we found it, and they picked it up from where they abandoned it. Unless, of course, they came up with something great to swap for it, like a battleship. I explained all this to General Cushman, but he was unimpressed and launched into what had become a familiar tirade. "Hackworth, let me remind you that you are a member of the United States Army. You are not down here with your own separate army. You do not make the rules. You are not the law. You belong to a higher command, and you are responsible and reportable to that command. Do you understand me?" "Roger, sir," I responded, as I usually did. "I'm sorry, I must have gotten carried away." In the case of the cement mixer, however, I added that the Navy would take it over my dead body, and they never did get it as long as I was in the zone. So as far as Cushman went, I generally ended up doing exactly what I had planned to do anyway. Though the general sometimes got mad, he usually looked the other way because in the final analysis he was interested in only one thing: results. And Team 50 was giving him results. So, when it all shook out, General Cushman was wrong about me and my command. I did have my own separate army in the zone, and I was the law. It would be untrue to say that I wasn't myself in my last command, but I was not the man I'd been 9 years before when Colonel Johns led the vanguards into Berlin, or even 5 years before when Tim's Travelling Trouble began its whistle-stop tour of battle areas all around South Vietnam. I was 40 years old, and I'd suddenly realized that the army, this rotten gal I'd been madly in love with for the last 25 years, wasn't going to mend her ways. It was as if I knew that no matter what I did or what I said, I was always going to find her cheating, find somebody else in our bed, as it were. And while in the past I'd always swallowed the disappointment and the hurt and backed away, saying, "Sorry, honey, I'll come back in an hour," thinking that everything would be okay, then in the zone it occurred to me that maybe I was wasting my time. "The army isn't what it used to be," I lamented to General Cushman one day. "It never was," he replied. I didn't want to admit it, but I knew he was right. After all, An Eagle, that extraordinary epic army novel, had recently been published. In it, author Anton Mira had well expressed how the hunts of the army world, the callous career-first ticket punchers exemplified in the butchering character of Courtney Massingale, had been gliding past the Gasses and Hayes and Janies in Myra's world, epitomized in the character of decent warrior Sam Damon for generations and always would. So it was just unfortunate that I, who'd set my sights on being a buck sergeant in the marvellous Trieste days that moulded me as a soldier and began my love affair with the army, had somehow never gotten the word. In mid-November, Brigadier General Jack Hemingway, my battalion commander from the 223rd in Korea and now CG of the Aviation Brigade, flew into the zone to announce that the War College list had just been published and my name was on it. Because I had deferred the previous 2 years, the news wasn't a surprise, but it was wonderful to see General Hemingway again, and I appreciated his hearty congratulations. I didn't have the courage to tell him I wasn't going to attend. However, other than Ward and Jenny Bates, the first to know were the Army personnel managers to whom I wrote as soon as I got the official word, requesting that I be removed from the Senior Service School list permanently. My reason for this was simple. I have no aspiration to be a general officer and no desire to work in positions where this education is required. Hence, it would be selfish of me to use a much sought-after quota when more ambitious types are available. As I wrote less loftily to Jim Mitchell, my buddy from the 2nd Corps days, I had no aspirations to be a general because I had known only a few good ones. Besides, I would have to buy new uniforms and become a phony. A bird who doesn't give a damn and who everyone is afraid of because his back is straight and he cannot be intimidated. Effectively, I was ending my career. I knew I'd soon be promoted to full colonel, and without a star to aspire to from there, and no war college meant no advancement for sure. I had nowhere to go. But as I wrote to Jenny Bates, I no longer had a burning dedication towards the army, or, for that matter, America as it exists today. So I refused to serve it just because of the attainments which appeared to be certain. I was glad I was going to make Bird. The prestige and retirement pay were better, but now that the decision to quit had sneaked up on me and been made, I had to rethink some plans. My first decision was, after the zone, to get myself a non-troop fat army job outside of the United States to ride out the mandatory 2-year service. The promotion cost me. My second decision after that was to just fade away. There was a tremendous amount of heartbreak involved in all this. I felt the army had failed me, and through its ineptitude it had inexcusably failed the nation every American soldier was tasked to defend, that nation being the United States of America, not South Vietnam. And 20 years after Korea, I now understood the anger of Bill Smith's father over the death of his Raider son. Back then, I'd condemned him for not understanding there was a price of admission to the American way, a price the immigrant Mamura had borne without complaint. But now I could see through the Vietnam debacle that while there was a price to be paid, it was only correct to pay it if the product, democracy, was sound. And it was not sound in the corrupt ranks of South Vietnam's government and military. Nor had it ever been, nor would it ever be, regardless of how many of America's sons threw their lives into the pot. As a nation, we had to get out of there. I'd always been one to speak my mind, but my hurt during this period, added to the fact that I knew I was getting out, made me too frank, too candid about how the war and Vietnamization were going. Old friends like Joe Love would attend briefings I was tasked to give, and later comment to me about my cynicism. After a while, I was not asked to do such briefings anymore. The endless stream of visitors who'd characterized my previous tours, who came to me for the straight skinny on the war, dried up. It was not because I was getting out, no one knew, but because of my attitude. As a reliable source put it, which had potential guests being dissuaded from visiting the zone, the word was I was a little battle-rattled. And maybe I was. I'd never know. All I knew was that Barney K. Neal had been killed at Pleiku on the 1st of September of that year, 1970, bringing home probably more painfully than any of the other drops on the stone of my consciousness the terrible, wrongful waste of it all. In any event, we in the zone were effectively cut off from making positive comments to correct the ills that beset the system. My recourse was in writing articles that were more and more truthful, and consequently more and more abrasive, yet which continued to be published in military publications. My press friends, most of whom I'd met and played poker with at the Pleiku press camp when I was at 2nd Corps, gladly accepted my leaks and non-attributable statements, which assisted them in telling the truth of the Vietnamization farce. Meanwhile, in my command, I gave in to the urge to hurt my too well-loved lady as badly as she'd hurt me. First and foremost, my aim was to make her look foolish. Consequently, while I'd never been one for regulations, as time passed in the zone, I went out of my way to break every rule I could. I took immense joy in screwing the system, joy that was only matched by the fact that, in the process, my men had some of the best damn times of their lives. Every day I sent one of my bird dog reconnaissance aircraft to Saigon to get the latest movie for my troops to see that night, or to bring in steaks for the outdoor snack bar. Experience had shown me the VIs didn't exactly pounce on the intelligence such planes provided, so I knew one aircraft would never be missed. Through our unauthorized fund, we kept a safe house in Saigon and installed Frenchy Fry there, designating him Team 50's unauthorized liaison officer at MATV. His principal job was to cut through the mountains of red tape that accompanied all promotions, awards, orders, and getting good replacements for the team. Often all this required was giving just the right little souvenir to just the right person, and Frenchy quickly proved a master at knowing which button to push. VC weapons were always in, but the best bribe these days was the Vietnamese jump badge, which had to be authorized by the VIs. Every glory-hungry desk jockey wanted to wear that one, and Frenchy had an inside line into getting them on short notice. Fry was also in charge of all major scrounging efforts, although he preferred to call it relocating government property in Saigon. As required, he could even switch gears to play mother hen to fellow team members when they visited the big city on their in-country R&Rs. Every day we had morning and evening briefings on the war and my responsibilities. We'd thrash out what was being done right and wrong and how things could be improved, etc. Though these were always damned effective working sessions, that did not mean they had to be deadly serious. For one thing, I insisted that all participants feel free to question and challenge me to think, rather than simply yes-sarring their way into my good books. This brought new vitality to the proceedings and fresh ideas to our operations, not to mention keeping me on my toes. In the almost quarter of a century since my stern disciplinarian days as a trust corporal, my command style had evolved significantly. Now it was closer to the Israeli way of doing things. I was still the boss, and the final decisions were mine, and everyone knew it. But all in all, there was less emphasis on the Mickey Mouse, and more on listening to subordinates. I was wasting my time. The army isn't what it used to be, I lamented to General Cushman one day. It never was, he replied. I didn't want to admit it, but I knew he was right. After all, Once an Eagle, that extraordinary epic army novel, had recently been published, and in it, author Anton Meyer had well expressed how the hunts of the army world, the callous career first ticket punchers exemplified in the butchering character of Courtney Massingale, had been gliding past the gases and hazes and gynets in Mayor's world, epitomized in the character of decent warrior Sam Damon for generations, and always would. So it was just unfortunate that I, who'd set my sights on being a buck sergeant in the marvellous Trieste days that moulded me as a soldier and began my love affair with the army, had somehow never gotten the word. In mid-November, Brigadier General Jack Hemingway, my battalion commander from the 223rd in Korea, now CG of the Aviation Brigade, flew into the zone to say that the War College list had just been announced and my name was on it. Because I deferred the previous 2 years, the news wasn't a surprise, but it was wonderful to see General Hemingway again, and I appreciated his hearty congratulations. I didn't have the courage to tell him I wasn't going to attend. However, other than Ward and Jenny Bates, the first to know, I wrote to the Army personnel managers as soon as I got the official word, requesting that I be removed from the senior service school list permanently. My reason for this was I have no aspiration to be a general officer and no desire to work in positions where this education is required. Hence, it would be selfish of me to use a much sought-after quota when more ambitious types are available. Or, as I wrote less loftily to Jim Mitchell, my buddy from the Second Corps days, I have no aspirations to be a general because I have known only a few good ones, And besides, I would have to buy new uniforms and become a phony. I want to be a bird who doesn't give a damn, and who everyone is afraid of because his back is straight and he cannot be intimidated because he doesn't care. Effectively, I was ending my career. I knew I'd soon be promoted to full colonel, and without a star to aspire to from there, and no war college meant no AR for sure. I had nowhere to go but, as I wrote to Jenny Bates, to no longer have a burning dedication towards the army, or for that matter America as it exists today. So I refused to serve it just because of the attainments which appeared to be certain. I was glad I was going to make bird. The prestige and retirement pay were better, but now that the decision to quit had sneaked up on me and been made, I had to rethink some plans. My first decision was, after the zone, to get myself a non-troop FATAT army job outside of the United States to ride out the mandatory 2-year service. The promotion cost me. My second decision after that was to just fade away. There was a tremendous amount of heartbreak involved in all this. I felt the army had failed me, and through its ineptitude it had inexcusably failed the nation every American soldier was tasked to defend, that nation being the United States of America, not South Vietnam. 20 years after Korea, I now understood the anger of Bill Smith's father over the death of his raider son. Back then, I'd condemned him for not understanding there was a price of admission to the American way, a price the immigrant Mamura had borne without complaint. But now I could see through the Vietnam debacle that while there was a price to be paid, it was only correct to pay it if the product, democracy, was sound. And it was not sound in the corrupt ranks of South Vietnam's government and military, nor had it ever been, nor would it ever be, regardless of how many of America's sons threw their lives into the pot. As a nation, we had to get out of there. I'd always been one to speak my mind, but my hurt during this period, added to the fact that I knew I was getting out, made me too frank, too candid about how the war and Vietnamization were going. Old friends like Joe Love would attend briefings I was tasked to give and later comment to me about my cynicism. After a while, I was not asked to do such briefings anymore. The endless stream of visitors who'd characterized my previous tours, who came to me for the straight skinny on the war, dried up. It was not because I was getting out, no one knew, but because of my attitude. As a reliable source put it, which had potential guests being dissuaded from visiting the zone, the word was I was a little battle-rattled. And maybe I was. I'd never know. All I knew was that Barney K. Neal had been killed at Pleiku on September of that year, 1970, bringing home probably more painfully than any of the other drops on the stone of my consciousness, the terrible, wrongful waste of it all. In any event, we in the zone were effectively cut off from making positive comments to correct the ills that beset the system. My recourse was in my writing articles that were more and more truthful and consequently more and more abrasive, yet which continued to be published in military publications, and my press friends, most of whom I'd met and played poker with at the Pleiku press camp when I was at Second Corps, gladly accepted my leaks and non-attributable statements which assisted them in telling the truth of the Vietnamization farce. Meanwhile, in my command, I gave in to the urge to hurt my too well-loved lady as badly as she'd hurt me. First and foremost, my aim was to make her look foolish. Consequently, while I'd never been one for regulations, as time passed in the zone, I went out of my way to break every rule I could. I took immense joy in screwing the system. That joy was only matched by the fact that in the process my men had some of the best damn times of their lives. Every day I sent one of my bird dog reconnaissance aircraft to Saigon to get the latest movie for my troops to see that night, or to bring in steaks for the outdoor snack bar experience. Experience had shown me the VITs didn't exactly pounce on the intelligence such planes provided, so I knew one aircraft would never be missed. Through our unauthorized fund, we kept a safe house in Saigon and installed Frenchy Fry there, designating him Team 50's unauthorized liaison officer at MACV. His principal job was to cut through the mountains of red tape that accompanied all promotions, awards, orders, and getting good replacements for the team. Often all this required was giving just the right little souvenir to just the right person, and Frenchy quickly proved a master at knowing which button to push. VC weapons were always in, but the best bribe these days was the Vietnamese jump badge, which had to be authorized by the VITs. Every glory-hungry desk jockey wanted to wear that one, and Frenchie had an inside line into getting them on short notice. Fry was also in charge of all major scrounging efforts, although he preferred to call it relocating government property in Saigon. As required, he could even switch gears to play mother hen to fellow team members when they visited the big city on their in-country R&Rs. Every day we had morning and evening briefings on the war, and my responsibilities as a Vietnamization thrash out what was being done right and wrong and how and what things could be improved, etc. Though these were always damned effective working sessions, that did not mean they had to be deadly serious. For one thing, I insisted that all participants feel free to question and challenge me to think rather than yes-sarring their way into my good books. This brought new vitality to the proceedings and fresh ideas to our operations, not to mention keeping me on my toes. In the almost quarter of a century since my stern disciplinarian days as a trust corporal, my command style had evolved significantly. Now it was closer than anything to the Israeli way of doing things. I was still the boss, and the final decisions were mine, and everyone knew it. But all in all, there was less emphasis on the Mickey Mouse, and more on listening to subordinates. We adopted as our briefing battle cry "Screw Ho Chi Minh," who was dead by now, but what the hell, which was sung out in unison and kept us mission-oriented. I also implemented a word and thought for the day program to open each morning's proceedings. The program was run by Captain Howard E. Cecil, our audit G2 advisor and resident military history whiz. The word for the day could be any word in the world, and the thought for the day could be from anyone living or dead. My own favourite word for the day was telesis, which was defined at the briefing as to make progress, because it appeared again a few days later in the morning's thought. To the South Vietnamese, the joker explained, "Telesis is a disease to be avoided like the plague. Right on, brother, right on." Briefing officers were encouraged to let their hair down and have fun during the proceedings. They had to have themselves together. If they didn't, they knew I'd nail them. But as long as AV-LNO BJ Jensen gave me an accurate report, I didn't mind if he appeared wearing his blue Black Hawk Civil War hat, or even better, his little cap with a propeller sticking out of the top, which he twirled around as he spoke. In fact, I encouraged it. I thought it was just fine if a briefer came out, as one did, with his hair parted in the middle and plastered down with Brill cream, wearing granny glasses and a little red paper heart stuck on his uniform over his own heart. Anything to eliminate the routine in the routine. The rule was I was not allowed to crack even the slightest hint of a smile. This, of course, was a great motivator for the men, and from time to time they did catch me out with skits and costumes that were just hilarious. Once I got them all back, however, with a little act I cooked up with Captain Stephen Bates, our adjutant, who was the last briefer of the evening. While Bates gave his normal report, I sank down in the high-backed leather armchair I always sat in the front of the room for the briefings so that none of the other guys, who all sat behind me, could see what I was doing. I put on a long-haired hippie wig that balding Frank Schwetz's sister had sent him as a joke and a spare pair of granny glasses. When I was ready, I gave Bates the signal to launch into our pre-arranged routine. "Sir, I've noticed that a number of the men are growing sideburns," he said. At this time in the Army, Chief of Staff Westmoreland's magic panacea for all the screwed-up and angry draft and the problems they caused across the board was to let these men have beer in the barracks, no KP, long hair and sideburns. It didn't work because, while the Army got rid of the offending military traditions, it did not replace these traditions with anything that fulfilled their basic and essential function, that is, to instill and maintain discipline. Sure, the changes helped keep outright rebellion at bay in various quarters of the Army, but if the Army expected its men to be effective on the battlefield, even to stay alive on the battlefield, discipline had to be the number one priority. So Bates said some of the men were growing sideburns. "Yes, I know," I responded sharply, staying low in my seat and ranting in the best tradition of Captain Queeg. "And it's going to stop today. I saw a man with 1.5 inches of hair on the top of his head." I saw a man with hair on the sides of his head and another man with hair on the back of his neck. These men will have white walls, nothing on the sides, nothing on the back, and 1 inch only on the top. Airborne haircuts. Do you men understand? There was no response behind me. The old man's done it now. The silence screamed. He's flipped right out of his head. Do you men understand? I bellowed and popped up over my chair to face them. The silence continued for another second as the men looked at my straggly wig and granny glasses in complete disbelief. Then they started to laugh. Bates and my trick brought down the house. It was a good way to end the day. About a week before Thanksgiving, the senior advisor to the 7th ARVN Division was fired, and Cushman selected me to go straighten out that unit. I didn't want to go. I'd worked hard in the zone, and I'd brought together a damn good team that I was very unhappy about leaving behind. As I wrote to Ward about the move, I was really tired of troubleshooting. I haven't got the spirit because I know that I'll squeeze ARVN and he will shape up a week after I leave. He'll be back to his old tricks, so why go through the frustration of squeezing the little bastard? But I couldn't refuse the assignment because I hadn't told, nor did I want to tell Cushman I was getting out of the army. I felt if he or Mao knew I was quitting, they would think I'd no longer care about doing a good job and be all over Team 50 like molasses. As it was, Cushman's once-a-month visits were almost too much. Thanksgiving came, and with it what I thought would be my last big bash with the men of Team 50, a proper dining-in honour of Major General Bill Henderson, my Australian friend, now CG of the Australian Task Force in Vietnam, who had helped get me in hot water, albeit unintentionally, on my last day at the Pentagon. The dining-in was an 18th-century British battlefield invention. Historically, its purpose was to preserve the amenities of civilization and normality in circumstances far from civilized or normal. As our letter of instruction, Loy, for the proceedings explained, it always took place in the field, and its participants were all the officers of the regiment who came together expressly for this formal dinner, which began with drinks and ended with toasts to the reigning monarch. When I was at 2nd Corps, I'd been invited to a dining-in at General Coran's mess in Nha Trang. The invitation had actually been engraved with a 3-star flag at the top and writing in gold ink. I did not attend. For one thing, it had seemed incredible to me that such a waste of time and assets would be condoned, much less encouraged. In my case alone, it was a 200 kilometres chopper ride just to get to Nha Trang, and there were people coming from all over the place. For another, since the vast majority of the participants in this war sat at desk jobs and the like in the huge plush base camps, their circumstances were completely civilized and normal. In the first place, the amenities of civilization and normality were just part of the Vietnam tour package. To me, a dining-in in such circumstances was little more than a slightly regimented dinner party and a wasteful, completely self-indulgent exercise. My point of view had not changed on this subject in the zone, but when Henderson said he'd be visiting from Neat at Thanksgiving, the dining-in concept seemed like a fun change for the team. Outsiders besides Henderson were not invited, and it was an appropriate tribute to a fine Aussie general. To put everyone in the spirit of things, Star Skier Hancock managed to acquire a dozen cases of VB, General Henderson's favourite Australian beer, and from the moment we cracked the first ones open upon Henderson's arrival, the somewhat irreverent Team 50 Thanksgiving dining-in was destined to be a great success. A few days later, just before I was to make the move to the 7th Division, my orders were cancelled when I landed in the hospital with excruciating stomach pains. After a lot of puzzlement and a lot of tests, it was discovered one of my kidneys had had an extra tube and it had become blocked. That's what a dining-in will get you. It was not a serious affliction, and the flare-up could not have come at a more opportune time. Not only was I spared the transfer to the 7th Division, but I was out of the hospital and feeling fine in plenty of time for the highlights of the holiday season. The Christmas party Team 50 gave for the mostly Buddhist VITs who worked in the compound. Our slush fund allowed for a 6-piece Viet band, tons of Vietnamese food, free drinks, a gift of $1 American converted to pista at the best black market rate of exchange we could get, and a couple of cartons of cigarettes for each worker. And the first annual Rice Bowl football game, which was played on New Year's Day, 1971. The action officers in charge of the Rice Bowl operation had magically transformed Tanti Airfield into a perfect 100-yard American football field, complete with plywood goalposts on each end, regulation markers, and umpires in black and white striped shirts. They'd also organized sideline activities, including hot dog stands and enthusiastic Vietnamese cheerleaders, our club girls in short little skirts. The two teams for the game were the Team 50 Studs and the 52nd Signal Battalion, a communications platoon of which was attached to us, lightning bolts. I had $300 riding on my studs with the comm sergeant, whom I drunkenly made the bet with at the New Year's Eve party the night before. What the comm sergeant didn't know was that while his people were all high school amateurs from way back, I had a team of 11 football stars from various universities. The studs had it made in the shade. The game began, and surprisingly, the communicators made the first touchdown. Then they got the second and the third. By the end of the first half, it was 21-0. We were getting our asses thumped, and the comm sergeant was singing in a display of New Year's cheer, and with just a speck of guilt for stacking my team with ringers. I'd even spotted him 14 points. I couldn't understand it. I sought the advice of Frank Schwett, who'd been a great football player in his day. "I'll tell you what's wrong," he informed me. "You've got 11 stars out there. They all think they're in charge. I think you better go out there and tell them there can only be one quarterback, because if all of them keep on showboating like they're doing, not only are they going to lose, but they're going to have their asses wiped all over the field." I went over to the team. "Listen, boys, this is serious. Not only are we losing the game, but we're losing it to legs. We've got to turn it around." "Q," I turned to Captain Q for Quan Coy Stevens. "You're the quarterback. You call the plays. Everybody else just listen and do what Q says you follow, okay? So let's get with it." And they did. In the second half, everything clicked. The signal guys never scored again, and not only did we win, but we ran up the score to 37-21. I picked up my $300, and the game was recorded for posterity by our own long-haired reporter, who made sure it was duly noted that the one player most responsible for the win was the team's quarterback, a one-time flame of the author's own novel. It was a hell of a way to end a pretty good year. A few days later, as I was preparing to leave the zone for the last time, my schedule showed the arrival of a special friend of mine, retired General Edwin G. Summerfield, now a regular customer at one of the zone's various nightly poker parties. Summerfield had been a long-time friend and my mentor. His visit was to commemorate his promotion to Brigadier General and as an old 4th Armoured buddy of mine. We'd kept in touch through the years, and I was honoured to have him with us for this last week. I enjoyed his visit, and his presence was a tribute to my work with Team 50. We had dinner and celebrated together before he had to leave. I could tell he was quite impressed by how much we had accomplished in our time together. Finally, it was time to depart. My orders came through, and the day of my leaving came at last. I packed up my gear and prepared to head back to the States, to a new chapter of my life beyond the army. I knew I would miss the camaraderie and the thrill of the work, but I also knew it was time to move on. As I boarded the plane, I took one last look at the land I had served and the people who had made it so memorable. With a mix of sadness and anticipation, I began the journey home. He was a damn good leader who set the example and demanded total commitment from his subordinates. He respected the role of the advisor, so there was no game playing between us, a remarkable feat given that I was his 32nd advisor and he could have had every routine down cold. He did not require bribery or coercion to get the job done. He was my kind of man, and as well as slipping right into an ideal commander-advisor relationship, we quickly became good friends. He agreed with me that ARVN's problems were bordering on terminal, and that the key to winning was to be found in the regional and popular territorial forces. Together, we implemented a program of territorial or mobile training teams, an idea I'd gotten from the Australians. We used underworked personnel from my overstaffed HQ to train RF units to provide reliable security at the village level. There seemed no question that the people could be won to our side if they knew they were really secure. They would not be afraid to ban the VC from their villages, denying the enemy recruits, food, intelligence and support. Mars fish would be without water and their effort would necessarily dry up. Colonel Hahn had been totally against the concept, so until General Hai arrived, this kind of training in the zone had been virtually the one-man effort of Team 50's Captain Che Menjivar, whose real name was Milton. But the short, baby-faced, eternally insubordinate El Salvadorian by birth acted far more like the recently deceased revolutionary Guevara than some guy named Milton, so we just changed it. He had gone from RF unit to RF unit teaching night ambush patrols with 2 Ranger NCOs. Under General Hai, the mobile training team program was expanded to 5 teams, each consisting of an American captain, 2 NCOs, and a Viet interpreter. These teams were sent to various districts for up to 3 weeks each to train the individual units. At the end of these training sessions, the teams would move on, leaving the VIT units to fend for themselves, rather than, as was standard procedure, continuing to lean on their advisor to make things turn out right. That was the part Colonel Han hadn't liked, that we'd pull out and leave his units on their own. But of course, that was the whole idea. The war would soon again belong to the Vietnamese, and after almost a decade of lip service about getting them to fight, it was my intention in the zone, as it had been in the airborne, that they would do exactly that and do it well. As Mao said, and as Team 50 picked up as its motto, "Give a man a fish and he'll have 1 meal. Teach a man to fish and he can eat forever." Under General Hai, we also initiated an ambush academy to train RF officers in this most effective tactic for fighting the guerrillas. We put tremendous emphasis on artillery training too. The use of artillery, once the big stick of the South Vietnamese army, had to be relearned by the Viets urgently, as the wind down of the US effort slashed the number of American gunships available to the zone. The program was well worth the effort, with a lot of hard work and spot inspection teams who swooped unexpectedly into fire bases to check the individual guns and crews. After a few months, we saw marked improvement in the readiness and accuracy of the zone's artillery units and in the confidence of the Viet infantry who depended on that artillery in a close support role. One area Hai was unable to make inroads in was the attitude and performance of our attached Vietnamese Air Force helicopter units. Without a doubt, they were the most dangerous collection of amateur flyers I'd ever seen, matched only by 99% of other VNAF units in the war. I had reached the point of categorically refusing to fly in any VNAF-maintained or flown aircraft. Among the final straws that led to this decision was a moment when I was sitting in a VNAF chopper as the only American amidst a Vietnamese pilot and co-pilot, a Vietnamese crew chief and gunner. As we were about to get underway, the pilot, who had been chatting away in Vietnamese to his passengers and crew, looked to his crew chief and said in English, "Coming hot." The crew chief responded, "All clear." When I heard that, I knew we were in serious trouble. The more mechanical the weapons with which we fight become, the less mechanical the spirit that controls them must be, as Field Marshal Wavell wrote. Yet here were these VNAF pilots parting like robots, the words of their Fort Rucker USA instructors not relating to them enough even to translate them into their own language. While VNAF's striking limitations were well known to those whose operations and lives depended on them, it was only when General Tri of the Cambodian invasion was killed along with Newsweek's 24-year Indochina veteran journalist François Sully in a neglected bird that burst into flames mid-air that the cheerleaders for Vietnamization began to investigate and discover they had a problem on the airmobile side of things. Only then did they recognize that the VNAF personnel who'd been sent to America at America's expense for up to 32 weeks of helicopter training plus 6 weeks of instruction in English were coming back with vague concepts in disjointed English that they were unable to explain, much less perform, and that those tasked with maintenance felt that as long as the chopper logs, which they doctored daily as necessary, reflected that maintenance had taken place, they'd done their jobs. Meanwhile, back at the 44th STZ, our Viet allies were stealing fuel and equipment from our Tanti and Much HOA staging fields at a remarkable rate. At Tan alone, in one 7-day period, enough fuel was stolen to sustain an entire air cavalry package of 13 choppers, plus 4 each of Slicks, Cobras and Lows for 6 days of normal combat operations in the zone. The skiers regularly stole flares and ammo as well. They also had a thing about ammo crates, which they generally took empty after uncrating the contents and leaving them, rockets, minigun ammo, whatever was going, scattered all over the airfield for the rains to destroy. This did little to foster goodwill between our men and the Vietnamese, and in fact, there was an increasing number of xenophobic incidents in the zone where comments or criticisms, usually warranted but often snidely delivered by American personnel to Vietnamese, resulted in fistfights or weapon brandishing. Throughout this period, while my honeymoon with Hai continued, the quiet hope his arrival had brought faded away. We did everything in our power to get the Viet troops off their asses, but the bottom line was they did not have the in-depth leadership to bring them up for the long-term game. The NCOs were tired and burned out. They'd seen far too much combat. The junior officers, lieutenants and captains, were just not motivated to win the war, and the majors, lieutenant colonels and colonels, who should have provided that drive to win, served only as role models and inspiration for corruption. The only way to infuse ARVN with strong leadership immediately would have been by taking the top US studs out of US units or advisory jobs and giving them command of ARVN companies, battalions, regiments and divisions. They, in turn, could have selected the best men based on ability, not connections, who would then OJT under the American officers until they got it right. At that point, the Americans would go home. The process might have taken 4 to 6 years, so all the studs would have to be combat bums, a generic derogatory term generally used by tourists to describe officers who copped out by volunteering for repeated tours in Vietnam, rather than returning to stateside duty and the multitudinous career-related activities expected of a modern army officer. But that was all right. What we needed, what we'd always needed to win this war, were combat bums. Volunteers would have queued up for the long-term command advisory jobs. The technique itself was a proven one, having worked time and again for the British in their Gurkha and other colonial units. Even at this late stage, the plan in Vietnam would have been well worth the effort. For my money, it was really the only viable option left. I truly believe that if Hai, a great general for the zone, in tandem with the even greater General Truong, could not turn ARVN's fortunes around in our area, then it just wasn't going to happen at all. This belief was only reinforced when President Nixon expanded the war yet again in February 1971 by launching Operation Lam Son 71, an invasion into Laos designed to sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail. All the US advisors were left behind, and besides some US Special Forces pathfinders, this time it really was an all-ARVN show on the ground. Using the very best troops in South Vietnam, the Viets just blew it. They made a conventional attack and then immediately fell back on American air support to save their asses. We obliged with aircraft brought in from throughout Vietnam, Thailand and the Pacific. Nixon and Kissinger, while respecting their own rhetoric not to expand the ground war, had no hesitation about using air in as large quantities as possible. There is no limit, and we don't see any reason why there should be any limit on the use of that air power, declared Secretary of State William Rogers just before the Laos operation began. Unfortunately, the NVA were well prepared for the attack, with battle-ready troops backed up with tanks, anti-aircraft guns and surface-to-air missiles. In the 2 months of fighting that followed, more than 100 US helicopters were destroyed, and more than 600 hit, many badly, with 102 American aircrewmen's lives taken. Again, the NVA proved willing to take terrific casualties themselves during Lam Son 71, but they also took a hell of a lot of ARVN troops with them when they went. ARVN casualties were between 25 to 50% of the total troops involved. In the end, despite US fighter aircraft, choppers, gunships, artillery, and B-52 strikes, It was ARVN that scurried frantically across the border back into South Vietnam in undeniable defeat. 3 cheers for Vietnamization. I'd met Jennifer Bates on my first R&R to Australia, which I'd taken with John Westmoreland just before I took over the zone. Jenny was a Deborah Kerr lookalike, and I fell in love with her at breakfast the minute I saw her across the dining room of the Chevron Hotel on the Gold Coast. I didn't actually meet her until that evening, a meeting that began with a half-fast argument between us about American involvement in Vietnam. British-born Jenny had seen her share of gung-ho Yankee soldiers in her job as a stewardess for Australia's Ansett Airlines, and I think she expected me to fit the mould. She was not a little surprised when our first fight quickly petered out, with me agreeing with almost everything she had to say. When I went back to Vietnam, we began to exchange letters. Soon we were getting together about once a month as well, thanks to the regular 3-day leave I got as a senior advisor as part of the handclasp program. Over time, Jenny also became an honorary member of Team 50, kind of playing the Frenchy Fry liaison role for my guys who took their R&Rs in Sydney, telling them where to eat, where the parties were, etc. When her annual vacation came up in mid-March, I thought the least we could do was return all her favours and have her as our guest in the zone. As a British subject, Jenny was free to visit Vietnam at will and could simply fly into Tan Son Nhut commercially. Ben Willis thought the idea was crazy and tried to dissuade me from going ahead with the plan. I told him I was the boss and I could do anything I damn well wanted to. Ben's voice of reason was often too much for me to take during this period of my rebellion, leading to many bitter fights between us. I even organised for Judge Cooney's journalist wife, Catherine, to get accreditation from Mass so she could come over as a reporter during the same period, in case I ended up having to be away for 4 or 5 days on some big operation, and Jenny would otherwise be left alone. Just before the visit, I was promoted to full colonel. It was a proud day, made all the more special by Hank Emerson, now a brigadier general and commander of the Special Warfare Centre at Fort Bragg. Hank sent me a gift of the colonel's insignia he had worn until his promotion, the Silver Eagle, which had belonged to his father before he made general. What a good friend Hank was, writing me encouraging letters as my spirits flagged more and more, and trying again and again to turn my mind away from getting out. The team gave me a big, raucous promotion party, organised with love by old soldier and fine NCO Larry Portman. When it was all over and I was alone in my quarters, I marvelled at the singular event that had made it all possible. Whatever its outcome, the Vietnam War had made me a colonel and paved the way for 1, maybe 2 or 3 stars if I stayed in. Yet the Vietnam War, through what it had shown me, had destroyed my great love affair with the army and made me decide to hang up my uniform. Or had it, I wondered. The day I made colonel, the choice had never seemed so hard. Then Jenny arrived, and for 2 weeks I thought of nothing else. We were together every night and during the days when we could be. She came along in the chopper when I went visiting individual units and border ranger camps, and proved her mettle too, not losing her cool even when one compound we were visiting came under mortar attack, or when we took a Special Forces airboat ride up the Mekong River and had sniper slugs snapping over our heads. She was the greatest morale booster my advisors out in the boonies could ever have dreamed of seeing, and the same had to be said for the guys at the Team 50 compound. Jenny and Catherine were the first round-eyed women most had seen in months, and the men hovered around them like lovesick kids. I couldn't blame them. I'd organised an R&R to Hong Kong to coincide with the end of Jenny's tour of the war zone. She flew commercial, and I met her there. We had a ball, even if I did spend a small fortune on uniforms for my next and last army assignment at NATO in Brussels as chief of the US Army section. The job was a far cry from the first one they offered me, a hush-hush Special Forces assignment in which I would have controlled all covert operations in northern Thailand. It was hard for me to believe I'd actually refused a hot SF job and held out to work in the make-believe world of NATO. But then again, a decade before, I never would have believed it if someone had told me I'd be checking out of the army anyway. But first, as soon as I got back from Hong Kong, Team 50 received its annual Inspector General (IG) inspection. The purpose of these inspections was to make sure everything was above board and conforming to Army regulations. Since the team was just one big broken rig, we had quite a bit of cleaning up to do to prepare. To be on the safe side, I organised for the IG and his team to be quartered with one of my subordinate units just down the road, rather than have them stay with us at Team 50. I shipped the few malcontents I had on the team off to distant outposts and put the rest of the men back in their OD fatigues. We folded up the outdoor snack bar and, for the purposes of the inspection, deemed it a kitchen annex. We told Mr. Coe to give the steam and cream girls a few days off and made sure no Vietnamese went anywhere near the PX. We put all our hot vehicles, save one, in an area fenced off and guarded by a Viet with a sign above it in Vietnamese, so the IG would leave it alone, thinking it belonged to the Viet unit next door. The one hot jeep we kept out was the one we gave the IG to drive around in throughout his visit. That was my own little joke to have a silent laugh over each morning when the IG pulled up to the compound. Most of the team knew the vehicle was hot too. When we came through the inspection with flying colours and had the IG gushing with praise in his exit interview, one of his most favourable comments regarded the team's morale, citing the smiles that greeted him each morning when he drove through our gate in his jeep. In January of 1971, an ABC journalist named Howard Tuckner came to see me in the zone. He'd read about my military career and wanted to do a television version of the chapter for his network. I told him to go home. In the first place, he struck me as a phony, and in the second, while his 8-part 10-minute segment series would be great for his career, it would certainly do little for mine. Even if I was going to quit, I still had 2 years of NATO duty to go, and going on national television to tell the American people how badly we'd botched the war did not seem a particularly smart thing to do. But Tuckner was undeterred. I heard from him regularly in the subsequent months, which saw the debacle in Laos, the disintegration of our own battlefield in the zone despite all of Hai's efforts, and our outposts being gobbled up at an alarming rate. I had finally said enough to those massive briefings that persuasively reported victory was at hand, even though I knew what I saw on the ground was exactly the opposite. These events, coupled with Tuckner's doggedness, began to wear me down. We had kidded ourselves and the American people long enough, and it was too late for me to start playing the old go-along-to-get-along game just because it would serve me best. So I began seriously to contemplate blowing the whistle in this most public of ways on national television. Whether or not to do the show became a number-one concern for me. I probably asked my own advisors, Willis, Hancock, Frank W., Ed Clark, Steve Bates, Jack Hout, G3 advisor Doug Randalls, and Judge Cooney, every single day what they thought I should do. While old soldier and NCO realist Shett said not to touch it, my young idealistic officers were behind the thing 100%. There were truths that had to be told, they encouraged. But I remained tied up in knots inside. There were few things as taboo in the military as criticising it outside the fold. As I wrote to Jenny, I'd been in the army so long I was like one of Pavlov's dogs. To speak out was against everything I'd been trained for. It was also against everything I'd believed in, against something I'd loved for so long and still did. After all, despite the times I'd felt the army had failed me, it had also upheld me for most of my life. But what other avenue was left? I'd written memos and letters to my superiors, those generals who'd become friends, and articles for the army at large on every germane issue I thought confronted the American fighting man and advisor in Vietnam. I'd convinced Slam of the need for the Vietnam primer we wrote. 2 million copies were in print. I'd proved on the ground with the men of the 39 how to fight the war on the cheap in a way suitable for a protracted guerrilla conflict, which was the only hope for success. I'd talked to General Johnson, the Army Chief of Staff. I'd talked to Stanley Rior, the Secretary of the Army. I'd contributed as honestly and pointedly as I could to that paper General Westmoreland requested in 1968 when he became Chief of Staff on where the war had taken us and where we were to go from there. I'd talked to anyone who came to visit my commands, because I'd been told I was someone until I got tired of standing there politely, as I watched my words go in one ear and out the other of my guest, and began to talk even more bluntly. I'd leaked information and stories to trusted pals in the press, thinking they could make a dent in the mindset of the army hierarchy. In a word, I'd tried. But that fact didn't make the decision to go public any easier. Then two things happened, and the decision made itself. First was a promotion list that showed Ira Augustus Hunt Jr., already a 1-star, on the 5% list to Major General. Second was the conclusion of the Cali trial, which had the recycled OCS lieutenant found guilty of premeditated murder, only to have President Nixon step in and declare that he would personally review the case. While the two events on one level had nothing in common, on another, they said it all about what was happening to the army. As much as I could possibly do something about it, I just couldn't let it go unremarked. In and of itself, the Cali case was a microcosm of everything that was wrong with the army. I'd first heard the rumour about My Lai when I was in the Delta with the 39, and I'd strongly denied even the possibility of it having happened. I'd fought a lot of years as an infantryman and seen my share of what could be called atrocities, but never had I seen, nor could I ever imagine, American soldiers involved in such a massacre of women and children. In my experience, it just wasn't in the American soldier's mentality. Obviously, this was before I studied Sand Creek and other infamous moments in our Army's Indian fighting days. Nonetheless, when the truth came out, despite the determined effort of C's battalion, brigade and division commanders to cover it up from the Army, and the Army's determined effort to cover it up from the press, what the facts revealed made the crime only too believable. My Lai reflected the horrific inadequacies in the training system, which, rather than coming to terms with the fact that attrition in the schools was a fact of life, pushed proven incompetent men through the system and allowed them to lead platoons in combat. The events at My Lai reflected the inadequacy, to the point of total absence, of senior leadership all the way up C's chain of command. As Colonel Lucien Truscott III, son of World War II's fighting General Truscott, wrote, "Would My Lai have happened if Custer, Division CG, and Henderson, Brigade CO, and Barker, Battalion CO, all of whom have claimed that they saw and heard nothing, had been down on the ground where the killing was going on?" In that, the men whose careers stood to be least enhanced by the events at My Lai actively suppressed information, or even worse, simply closed their eyes to cover their own asses instead of immediately and severely punishing the participants in the massacre. My Lai reflected a tragic bankruptcy of moral fibre in the Army's senior officer corps, a direct result of rampant careerism. To me, all this was bad enough. But then, when the Army actually had the balls to stand in the door and convict Cali for murder, to have Richard Nixon come along and, for purely political ends, interfere with military justice and essentially nullify the result was too much for me. The kid was guilty as hell, having judged him so. The Army had to start addressing its own inadequacies to find out how it could have allowed such a leader to get through the system in the first place. But Nixon's action was as good as excusing the Army from even beginning that self-examination. Fundamentally, it was the worst thing that could have happened since My Lai itself. So that was one thing that pushed me in the direction of going public. As for the second, the attendant rumour of Hunt being picked up below the zone to Major General was that he was going all the way, that this man would one day be Chief of Staff. It was once an eagle all over again, and I was horrified. It was as if I'd climbed to the highest rung of the ladder, only to find the ladder was leaning against the wrong wall. If Hunt was what the Army now considered a stud, the kind of man to lead it into the 80s, then, as far as I was concerned, the Army had been lying to itself for so long about so much that it had totally lost perspective of reality. So I got in touch with Howard Tuckner. 2 days later, he and his ABC boss, Nick George, were in Cowan, and for some 16 hours we discussed the content of the interview, which was to be filmed the following day and aired on ABC TV's Issues and Answers in early July after my tour was over and I was out of Vietnam. It was almost midnight when we finished up, and I found myself all alone and scared to death. I wrote to Jenny that the TV camera would be worse than facing a platoon of machine guns. We'd try not to be too abrasive, but I wanted to speak the truth of what was happening in Vietnam. If my efforts saved one life, then it would be worthwhile. In the morning, the crew arrived. Howard was there, and Willis and Tuckner chatted with me while the crew set up. I tried to hold my apprehension at bay. Just as everything was ready and I was about to sit down in front of that television camera, one of my seamen brought in a back-channel message for me. It was from Hank Emerson in the United States, an invitation to be his deputy for a new leadership study group designed to find out what the hell was wrong with the US Army. Westmoreland had already approved my appointment. The timing of Hank's offer was most incredible. If that back channel had arrived the day before, I would have cancelled the show, no question about it. As it was, I was at a complete loss. Was it fate, God's 11th hour way of saying I was making a mistake, that I should stay and fight from within and not thumb my nose at my lifeblood, especially this way, by speaking out? In Vietnam, in uniform, I told Tuckner I needed some time to think. But when I thought all I could think of, despite Hank and despite his exceptional way of making things happen when everyone else was letting them slide, was West's study in '68. In good faith, I contributed to that report as one of 16 of the supposedly sharpest studs in the Army. 3 years later, it had changed nothing. After that experience, why did I believe that as an individual I somehow had the authority to bring those in power to their senses? I didn't know, but I did believe it. I truly believed that by going outside channels directly to the American people, I could make these guys think and bring about change. So, in the end, despite Hank's offer, there was not much of a decision to be made, and so the camera began to roll.